Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. I'm so delighted you've joined me this evening, wherever you are in the world, and you're so welcome to the channel. It's so exciting to have so many subscribers from so many different countries, and you're all welcome. Don't forget to get that lovely hot cup of cocoa or coffee, because I've got an amazing story for you tonight. So sending you loads and loads of love. And before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Zagnalia and I'm from a small, quaint little rural town in North America where everybody usually knows everybody and nothing stays secret for very long. I grew up in the vibrant, carefree era of the early 80s, which I believe without exception was the greatest time in history to be young. Let's not kid, the 80s music by far excels the music from latter or more recent generations. I certainly would never swap my life growing up in the 80s for the youth of today with their swanky cell phones and modern technology. Truly, I believe we had it so much better in those days, and our relaxed, easygoing childhoods were so joyously uncomplicated. I grew up as an only child with my mother and father, who both worked in the local town. My mother was a hairdresser and managed her own hair salon, and my father was an optician that sold glasses to the locals in our area. And believe me, business was always booming. Growing up, I lived in a vibrant rural street, and I say that because the symmetrical, rusty-looking ranch-style homes were painted exquisitely in beautiful, flamboyant Moroccan colour schemes, from stunning blues to greens, apricots, yellows, pinks and purples. Every house in those days had their own spacious backyard, usually dotted with fruit trees, flowers, shrubs, and of course the inevitable vegetable bed. Most homes had their own swimming pools and porches because we were big on entertainment in those days, so dancing at parties with smoking barbecues and bopping 80s music was certainly the order of the day, along with puffed-up hairstyles, shoulder pads, jeans and trendy leg warmers. Those were the days, my friends, that we thought would never end. Jokes aside, I remember that we lived on a large white gravel country road that ended in a wide cul-de-sac where a grand Victorian masterpiece stood, nestled away in the valley. This was a prime piece of real estate, where indeed the original homestead home from the area had stood in our street. It was indeed a resplendent, bright, sparkling jewel among a cluster of pretty white diamonds, as it rarely took central stage as the focal point in our street, because everyone who saw this mansion was quite literally awestruck and thunderstruck and bedazzled, because it quite truly was a mesmerising Victorian piece of art, if ever I saw one. This enchanting piece of Victorian architecture was magisterial, imposing and exceedingly palatial in its striking appearance, and had been lavishly converted into its original pristine condition of its bygone era. It was painted in an exquisite shade of turquoise blue, which seemed to enhance the regal aesthetics of this sumptuous, opulent-looking mansion all the more. The house bore the traditional characteristics of the Victorian style, as it possessed the traditional steep-gabled roofs, the little towers, the turrets, the dormers, including a wide wrap-around porch and pretty little shapely bay windows, and lots of ornate trim-work, so typical of the time, which adorned the house with a touch of masterful grandeur. This house was without exception unlike anything I'd ever seen before, and the entrance possessed one of those imposing black-wrought iron gates that was highly stylized with fancy detailed and exquisite scroll work that included leaves and flowers, and some that were literally touched with a little gold leaf that only added to the glamour and prestige of this extraordinary home. The gate overlooked an extensive long cobble and red brick driveway that was surrounded by some pretty manicured lawn on either side that was dotted with the occasional oak tree. And on the left-hand side of the house was a statuesque fountain with an impressive display of cascading water. The exquisite mansion was situated amidst beautiful rolling hills, along with a stunning forest on the left-hand side of the valley that was teeming with indigenous wildlife like the white-tailed deer and mule deer often seen scampering around our area. There was also a very beautiful backdrop of small, tall, majestic Douglas fir trees that stood behind the mansion. You could also see in the distance the soft, misty blue-grey outlines of the mountains that lay beyond. I can honestly say that the view of this home was so picture-perfect, it literally belonged on the cover of a classy vintage magazine, and no one would disagree with me. Growing up, there were so many speculative rumours about this impressive-looking Victorian mansion, whom many believed was haunted, and there were indeed the terrifying accounts of strange ghostly cloaked spectres that had been seen sighted in and around the property, which was hardly surprising, as the house was steeped in a large colourful history. As a little girl, I would always cycle past the mansion with my friends and gaze upon it in awe, and sometimes I was certain that some airy cloaked figure was staring back at me with a malevolent grin on his face. I know I sound crazy, but I am glad to say that other kids also observed the glares of a hooded cloaked figure goggling back at them through the upstairs windows. Although when we did tell our parents about our vivid impressions of the property, our parents would laugh at us, dismiss our allegations as being totally spurious. All these years later, I'm almost positive that I did indeed see a cloaked figure standing there in the window staring back at me, and that it wasn't a figment of my imagination. How I longed and yearned to walk down those stunning ornate black and white corridors belonging to that gorgeous home. As for me, it would be like taking a time capsule and being regressed to another period in the chapter of our colourful, illustrious North American history. Growing up, I was always curious and very inquisitive as a kid, but something about this house truly resonated with me and drew me to it like a magnet. And yet, in truth, there was also something airily sinister about the place, almost like it was holding on to a deep, dark, sinister secret from the past. As kids, we did have the most wonderful lives growing up. I certainly can't complain about that. But we did always wonder about the mysterious occupant at the end of the street that never ever interacted with the locals in our town. And I would always ponder why he chose to be so evasive, elusive, and keep himself so isolated. Some people would scoff and say, he just thinks he's above the rest of us. I would always wonder why he locked himself away in that massive mansion for months at a time, and why never once did he show his face in our town. And all we ever saw of him was his black limousine with the dark windows driving away from his home on many occasions, but we never got to see his face. One day our little rural town was amazed to see a black sparkling Rolls-Royce parked outside the local baker's that certainly got everybody's attention alerted, because it wasn't every day in our town that you would see such a sublime piece of gleaming, sparkling metal parked on our street. I was in the hair salon at the time, sweeping the client's grey hair off the floor. My mother was in the process of drying Gertrude Boswell's grey hair after her blue rinse shampoo. Believe it or not, they were discussing the old Victorian house in the cul-de-sac at the end of the road. "Rumour has it," said Gertrude, "that someone else has bought the Victorian house. It was owned by an elderly eccentric that died on the property about a year ago, and his brother only found his dead body lying in the bathtub 2 months ago." "Wow," said my mother, "that's the problem with being isolated. You can die alone, without anybody knowing or even caring about what's happened to you. Poor, poor man, dying alone like that, without anyone to care. Isn't that terrible? And for months on end at that." "It is sad," agreed Gertrude. "But imagine living in that huge spooky mansion all on your own like that. I'd hate it." "Well, you do get eccentrics who love to be alone," said my mother. "Solitary people that only enjoy their own company." "Well, my Freddie met him once when he went to fix the electrics at the mansion," piped Gertrude. "He said the old man was a cantankerous old miserable sod." "Mum," I said excitedly, "sorry to interrupt your conversation, but there's a black, really fancy Rolls-Royce parked outside at the baker's. I'm just going to see what the owner looks like." I put the broom to one side and dashed out of the glass salon door before my mother had a chance to protest. "That's Agnalia for you," I heard my mother chuckle. She's a right little nosy Parker. She must get it from me. Never could keep her nose out of anybody's business. I think it's the byproduct of living in a small town. We just love to gossip, and we adore snooping." "That we do indeed," agreed Gertrude. I entered the bakery and couldn't believe what I was actually seeing. Standing at the bakery counter, purchasing a loaf of bread and a large chocolate walnut cake, was a very beautiful woman. But she was attired in a Victorian dress that looked like she'd literally stepped out of the history books, only this woman was very real and very much alive. I would say the woman was about in her late 20s, with dark brown hair that was tied back in a pretty bun, with plaited hair on either side of her head. Her flawless pale skin was smooth and translucent, and she had pretty bright blue sparkling eyes, and she was also adorned in an emerald green satin gown with sloping shoulders, a low-pointed narrow waist, and a bell-shaped skirt with layers of petticoats underneath. "Are you going to a fancy dress party?" I piped, looking at the woman in awe, while everybody in the baker's was listening with flapping ears, as they were equally as enthralled, intrigued, and enchanted by this mysterious, fascinating woman, but were trying incredibly hard not to show it, but not really succeeding. "No," giggled the girl. "That's the way I always dress. I'm a little eccentric, you see, but I love everything Victorian, which is why I recently purchased the Victorian home on Baker Street. You know the one?" "Yes, I do," I marvelled. "It's a very beautiful home. I live on that street myself." "You do?" "Yes," I said. "It's incredible. I can't believe you've bought the place." "Well, I have. I've recently moved there," she said. "I do wonder if you might know anybody local who could possibly babysit for me on Saturday nights. I have a young boy called Edward who needs a babysitter, and I'm pretty desperate." "I'll do it," I piped very eagerly. "Well, that's settled," she said. "I think I can trust you. My name's Victoria, by the way." Fast forward to Saturday night, and I could hardly believe it. I was going to be spending that evening watching over little Edward, a 6-year-old boy who dressed in normal fashionable clothes like his dad, but it was only his mother Victoria that lived and breathed and acted Victorian. Victoria was quite literally a butterfly that had arrived in our local community, and she was indeed the talk of the town for a very long time. You would hear people in our town say things like, "That Victorian fashion is very fetching, but if we had to dress like that today, it would cost us a tidy fortune." "I truly admire her," said my mother, "because she's not afraid to express her individuality. She's comfortable with who she is, and I think it's perfectly charming. I really do." So there I was on a Saturday night, sitting in the grand living area of this exquisite Victorian home that was so lavishly decorated with such exquisitely gilded pieces of walnut, rosewood and mahogany furniture, all with sumptuous material coverings done in hues of ochre, browns, golds, burgundies and taupes, along with wooden ornate carvings everywhere. Then there were the typical period pieces like large lamps with fringe edges and pretty little lantern chandeliers, as well as postbox red Persian carpets, which were of course a little bit more modern. It was quite literally like stepping back in time. I'd always dreamed of walking down the black and white elegantly tiled ornate corridors and viewing this home from the inside, and now my dreams had all but come true. I was so beguiled and so bedazzled, I almost had to pinch myself to ensure that I wasn't actually dreaming. It truly felt like I was on the most dazzling film set, playing the part of a Victorian girl, only I wasn't dressed for that part. Victoria, on the other hand, looked like Scarlett O'Hara, elegantly attired in a very stunning velvet red gown that looked very suited to the stylish decor that surrounded us. Victoria was looking at me very earnestly. "I have a very grave concern about Edward," she said to me. "Since we've moved here, he keeps hallucinating and seeing things. He's a very imaginative child and always complains of a huge big face staring at him through the window. I often find him hiding under his bed because he's so frightened by this so-called creature. Of course, it's all just fictitious and made up, but he seems to think it's very real." So there I was, looking after an over-imaginative child while Victoria and her husband were out for the night. But in my opinion, little Edward was a very level-headed, grounded young boy, so I decided to ask him some questions. "Tell me all about the face at the window," I asked him curiously, "the one that your mother tells me that you're frightened about." "It's here every night, looking in at me through that window over there," said Edward. "It's a big hairy monster, but Mum thinks I'm making it all up. I can hear it grunting at me, and it taps on my window all the time, and it's got big red eyes, horrible red eyes." "Is there every night that it looks at you? Is that what you're saying?" "Yes, it's every night." "What do you suppose it actually wants?" I asked him. "I think it wants me to open the window for it. and that scares me a lot." "Do you want me to stay here with you tonight, Edward?" I asked, "so that you can show me the face that you see at the window?" Edward looked remarkably pleased. "You'll stay with me?" he said. "I'll show you the face when it comes. It's very, very scary." So there I was, sitting up in Edward's bed, having fallen fast asleep with the young boy's head on my lap, when quite suddenly I heard a very sharp tapping sound at the window, as well as a few grunts. Edward was indeed right. This creature, whatever indeed it was, wanted his undivided attention. But why, I could not imagine. And what was this creature? "It's him," said Edward. "Over there. Can you see him?" Imagine my amazement when I really did see the huge face of a very strange-looking creature staring in at us with these huge red eyes, and I could see that whatever this thing was, it was very definitely real. I wasted no time in racing out of the head to investigate this creature, because my blatant curiosity quite simply overcame my fear, and fear didn't even enter the equation. I grabbed the flashlight that I'd brought with me and ran after that creature as fast as I possibly could. And believe me, it was an incredibly fast animal. Looking back, I must have been completely stark raving mad, but I've never been a sensible person at the very best of times, and always been very impulsive and a risk-taker. Not intentionally, of course, but I do find I always tend to act before I engage my brain, which does mean that I can potentially be very reckless and very foolish. But that's me in a nutshell, I'm afraid. I could see the shadow of a dark creature almost floating towards the woods, because it moved with such a seamless grace. And when it saw me, it stood very still, as if waiting for me, until I was standing only yards away from it. I immediately flooded the creature with my flashlight, which it clearly did not appreciate at all, as my light was clearly bothering its deep-set brown eyes. For a moment I stood very still, hardly daring to move. What on earth was this creature, I wondered, because it was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. The creature was definitely female, and was utterly colossal, and was covered in long flowing brown hair with overlong arms, and possessed a human-like face, but with very definite ape-like influences. However, even with my flashlight, it was difficult to determine the details of her face, as much as I would have liked. The best way I can describe her to you was that she reminded me of King Kong in her stature and strength, but she was much more human-like in her appearance, and was also much more approachable. I would say that the creature had a warm, loving energy about her, which is why not even for a fleeting second did I feel any fear whatsoever. This was extraordinary because she was easily over 9 foot tall, 800 pounds, and 3 foot wide, so she was not small by any manner of means. I would say she was easily much bigger than your typical black bear, and certainly more powerful and majestic. If you were facing her and she was aggressive towards you, I can tell you that this would not stand a chance in hell. Well, you wouldn't stand a chance in hell against her, that's for sure. The critter looked at me with an awkward curiosity, and for a long moment our eyes locked in a stare. I immediately sensed the creature wanted me to help Edward, but I could not imagine why. It was almost like I registered that this message in my mind, almost like she was transmitting it to me telepathically. I want to stress this categorically has never ever happened to me before or ever since. I have never been that intuitive before. The creature reached out with her overlong arms and pressed something cold and hard in my hand, and she pointed towards the room where Edward was sleeping, and then to the stone in my hand. I could tell that this creature wanted me to give Edward the stone, and I sensed it was of pivotal importance, but I couldn't imagine why. I suddenly realised that the only reason that the creature was bothering Edward was simply because she wanted to give him this strange stone, which really was rather curious. I watched the creature in awe as she literally floated into the woods with such a seamless grace. I have never been so overwhelmed with a sense of such wonderment to observe such an extraordinary miracle of nature, as I believe that she indeed was. When I returned back to the mansion, I told Edward the great news. The creature did not mean to scare you, I assured him. But she was only tapping on your window to give you this. I think she believed it was very important." I handed the large stone to Edward, and I recognised it at once as a large topaz. You see, my Uncle James knows a lot about stuff like this, and he had told me once that the topaz stone was very significant and was used to ward off evil and to give you strength. "How strange that she should give you this," I mumbled. "The stone is used to ward off evil and to give you strength. Why would she give you this?" Suddenly little Edward burst into tears. "What's the matter, Edward?" I said. "Why are you so upset? Have I said something?" "How does she know?" asked Edward. "How does the creature know that I was praying to be looked after? I was asking God to send me an angel." Suddenly I grew alarmed. "Now you're scaring me, Edward. What's been happening to you?" "You must tell me." "Mummy never believes me when I tell her stuff, nor does Daddy, but they don't see what I see." "I believe you, Edward," I said. "Tell me, what do you see?" "It's this very ugly hooded figure. He has red eyes and no face that I can see, but he's been telling me that he's going to come and take me to hell because he says that I've got a debt to pay and it needs young blood." "This ghostly apparition said this to you?" I asked. "Does he say it to you every time you see him?" "Every time," said Edward. "He repeats the same message and his voice is very deep and hoarse and very scary." I sat there hardly believing what Edward had just told me. Was it possible that this topaz stone could indeed make the demonic entity go away? I'd never heard of that before, and I was exceedingly cynical and very doubtful. I wasn't certain that things could be this simple. Could topaz really solve this problem? But I suppose anything was worth a try, and let's face it, the creature seemed to think it would help. "I believe you, Edward. When I was younger, my friends and I would swear we saw a hooded figure standing in one of those upstairs windows of yours, and when it looked at you, we could feel shivers going down our spines because you could sense that evil. And I wasn't the only person to see that hooded figure. Many of us saw it." The following Saturday, when I visited Edward, he was a very different boy, and his mother was delighted and believed that it was all down to my babysitting ability. But I knew very differently. You see, Edward told me that for 3 nights that demonic entity, or the cloaked figure, should I say, did approach him 3 times in a row. The first time, when it saw the topaz stone, it hissed and then evaporated. It came 2 more times and then never ever returned. To this day, Edward really sincerely believes that God sent him a hairy angel in the form of Bigfoot, because we naturally found out only years later that the creature that I encountered in the woods was indeed a Bigfoot. As Edward so eloquently put it, I am sure not all angels are necessarily human. Some might be hairy or furry too. And why wouldn't God use a Bigfoot? When Edward was about 30 years old, he actually proposed to his wife with a ring using a part of the topaz that he'd got from that Bigfoot that was coloured blue, and he also had his own signet ring made up in his little finger with a stone. He believes it has brought him nothing but health, luck and good fortune ever since. And he doesn't care if anybody doubts his story, because he and I both know it's absolutely true. So there you are. That's my story. Well, I just want to thank you so much for that incredible story. Fascinating. I have heard that the topaz stone is used for warding off evil, so that's not the first time I've heard it. What an extraordinary story. And isn't it incredible? They do say that Bigfoots do have the ability to sense energy. So maybe the creature was being very protective towards Edward. Until next time, goodbye and good night.